My name is Mary Giberson. I was born May 31, 1927 in Huntington, West Virginia. I was born actually during the Depression, and I was the fifth child, and I don't think that I ever really understood as much as my brothers and sisters tell me about the Depression, because I was always the baby. And they remember it more vividly, but I had a very happy childhood. I was very close to my mother. I admired my father, but my mother was the one that nurtured me and spoiled me. And so I had older brothers and sisters, and because it was a very hard time economically, my father lost everything. And he had a couple of hardware stores, and my mother said, well, we're going to go to the country. We'll survive there. She could always depend on her family to help her. So we went to a place out of Huntington called Paradise. And that's my first remembrance, was living in Paradise. And my first dramatic occurrence was stepping on a chicken. And so I cried and cried and cried, and my mother put me to bed for a nap. And as far as early remembrances is living there, and they would sell guns and everything else to preserve food. And they put up berries and things that they grew in the garden, but that was our way of survival. So then we went to St. Albans to live with my grandmother and grandfather. And later on, things got a little bit better. And I went to school there in St. Albans. It was between Huntington and Charleston. We always went on a trolley to Charleston. And my mother was very political. And we'd always have to go for the opening of the legislature. So we'd always get on the trolley, go to Charleston to get that first event that was very important in her life. My grandparents were such advocates for the Democratic Party. They'd roll over in their grave if they knew that I hadn't always voted Democratic. They loved Roosevelt. He was on the mantle always. And so I grew up with a happy childhood there in St. Albans. Went to school first grade through the 12th grade. When I graduated from high school, we moved to Austin because my mother said we have to live in a university town. And I said, Mother, if I get out of high school, I'm not going to go to college. Well, it only took me a year out of college because everybody was going to college but me. So I was pretty glad to enroll at the University of Texas. I did get in the university, did enter the university, and the tuition was $35 a semester, but no fees for extra classes. I usually went for 15 hours. My first professor was Umlauf, and we were in the building that later is the Barker History Center now, and that was where the art building was at the time. And again, most of my friends were people that were a little bit older, back from the Army. They didn't really ever talk about World War II. Jack didn't talk about it. I was a junior at the University of Texas when I met Jack. In order to pay my art material fees, I would work at Scarborough's. And I would only work in certain departments. I would work in jewelry, and I would work in silverware. But I would say, nope, can't work. That's the only place I'll work. I think I was always interested in art. I was always a right brain learner. Had trouble with math and science and Latin. I think it's an interesting story. I actually failed algebra. And when I went to the university to apply, they said, well, we'll have to send for your transcripts. And I said, yeah, I have to send for my transcripts. Remember, I failed algebra, which wouldn't have even given me enough credits to graduate from high school. And so I said, okay, send them. And so I was surprised to get a phone call say, you have been entered in the university, come down and pay your fees. And so when I picked up my transcript, my principal in my high school had changed my F to a B. Otherwise, I would have had to take math, that was nice. But I was never a good student, but always good in art. And that was my forte. Like I said before, my first professor was Umlauf. And I would have trouble with my other classes, but I made A's in art, and that kind of compensated for the C's and D's. English was always a mystery. Math was always a mystery. So art was what got me through the University of Texas. We moved over to Army barracks that were there on Waller Creek. That's now the drama department. So I actually didn't go to the new art building. All 4 years were in that Army barracks. It was cold in the winter and hot in the summer. And we had these little decks that we would go out and get some air and drink Cokes. And I met Jack there in Scarborough, going down the steps to have coffee with his friend. And he later called me out for a date. We dated, and I finally one night I said, "Where do you live?" And he said, "Well, I live in Buda." I said, "Where's Buda?" So he drove out here one night late after we'd had a date, coffee, shows, whatever. That's mostly what we did. I wasn't a big dancer, neither was he. And so he drove out, and I thought, gee whiz, that was a long way from Austin. So he drove into Buda. All the lights were out, no street lights. Buda was like 250 population. And especially when we were coming out 967, it was a dirt gravel road with holes in it, following the fence lines, no curves. And so, "You live here?" And he said, "Yeah." His family had a dairy. We drove around, and they had gas tanks that they would fill up the creamery milk trucks with. So I remember the gasoline tanks came around the edge behind the house. And I think I was surprised that he lived so far from Austin, never knowing Buda until we came out one day during the weekend. And I liked Buda from the very beginning. We knew the people that had the grocery store, and they had several different sites. And we knew the lady who had the post office, several sites. They would change that. And I thought it was such a friendly place, and I liked the people. And so we dated for 2 years. He practiced law. I would go watch him at his little lawsuits, trials. And he took the trials where they couldn't afford. He was court appointed. And so we would go down 6th Street and look up the little bars and try to get witnesses and gather information there on East 6th Street for these poor criminals that he was representing. I was not eager to get married, and I was very happy at home. And I would get mad at him because he didn't show up for a concert or whatever else, because I found out later he was plowing the fields or working in the dairy. And so I'd get mad, and I'd take off his diamond ring, lick an envelope, and send back his ring. I'm not going to get married. And then we would court some more, and I'm not going to do that again, whatever it was. My problem was I was very happy at home and did not have marriage in the front of my brain. We dated for 2 years. He was practicing law. It was like 50. I'd finished university, working at Scarborough's, couldn't get a job with an art degree, so I designed the windows, picked out the clothes, did drawings for the windows, would go around and make everything fit. So I was a display person at Scarborough's, stayed with Scarborough's. And finally, we didn't have any money. And I kept saying, I don't have money to get married. I don't have money for a big wedding. And so we decided that the only way we're going to get married, he was having a hard time practicing law and running the dairy. We decided we just get married 1 weekend. So I got off Easter weekend, and we drove to Laredo, went by the Episcopal Church, got married, went to Laredo for our honeymoon. Came back to the farm because we really didn't have money for anything but to move in with the father. The mother lived in Austin, didn't like Buda. The father lived in this big old house by himself. Okay, we'll live in the farm, and then we'll get. At times, I would say, I'm not going to live like this. We need our own house. He continued to try to practice law, but he finally was able to get a job with the General Land Office. So he worked there for 42 years, was very successful. He was a chief clerk, worked under 5 land commissioners, was very happy. But we did raise our 4 children here on the farm, and they went to school in Buda. I continued to be active in PTA and ran for county, as a county trustee because I got mad at the school system during integration. We had a big fight in Buda over integration. And so when the kids Robert was in the 1st grade, I was very active trying to get the school integrated and had good friends that were very opposed to it. And so I knew I had a fight on my hands. I would go to the school board meetings and report for the Austin American. Ray Waddell was the reporter at that time. And so I would call in my story that had happened the night before. But the integration was a big deal in Buda. It was very, people really opposed to it. And one of the guys on the school board that had voted very much and very opposed to integration, he bulldozed down the black school the next morning. And that was devastating to me. I drove by the next morning and I thought, my gosh, where's the school? Well, they were so mad at me that they put my son, my 6-year-old son, Robert, on a school bus. They said, Mary, there's not room for him on the school bus. They would take him all the way to Austin, Manchac, back up to Driftwood, and drop him off 2 hours later. I said, you're not going to do that to me. And they said, well, you know, there's not enough room. There's too many kids. And I said, well, show me the kids' names. I would be so mad. The house has always interested me. It was in very bad shape. It has really only been lived in by the Cruz family that built the house in 1869. His first house was below, close to where his cotton gin was, and that was in the Eggleston survey. This is in the Allen survey. And so the house needed a lot of repair, but we lived with the father. We were not able to fix up the house and repair the porches and the back porch until we'd lived here about 10 years. The father died while he had a stroke over at the barn, milking cows. So I said, Jack, can't do it. Not going to do it. That was the ending of the dairy business. 1950 was beginning to phase out the dairy business because of the drought. You couldn't raise your crops because they were raising high gear and grains and storing it. But when you had to buy your own grain at the feed store that was active in Buda, no longer could you afford to be in the dairy business. The drought really ruined the dairymen. There were probably 35 dairies in the Buda area. I have always thought that Mr. Cruz from Missouri was close friends to Riley, who was from also Missouri, and developed the black community. Our fence lines border the black community, Antioch. And I think that Riley and Mr. Cruz, who bought land from Riley, knew each other well. And so I've always been fond of the black community, have friends in the black community. And when we were restoring the house after 10 years, one of the black members, L.D. Bunton, worked for the Kirkendall family. And Dorothy would drive him back and forth to the black community over there on Black Colony Road. And she laughed and she said, L.D. said, Miss Dorothy, I think they found that pot of gold. because we were beginning to restore the house and taking down the rotten boards and the rotten upper porch and putting in columns that we got from about 3 blocks north of the Capitol that Jack knew that they were selling. And so we turned it into more of a Greek revival from the original Italianate that David had built. So the house had 3 stages. David built it as an Italianate. They added on a second section to the house and built the 2-story porches upstairs and downstairs. It was so rotten that children later told me that they would drop down through the rotten boards on the front porch, crawl through, and come up the rotten boards on the back porch. And I wonder how many snakes and snails they passed, but that was one of their sports. My oldest is Robert. He practices law here in Buda. The next child is Richard. He taught at Southwest Texas, and he's in the construction business now. And Marianne was the first daughter, and she graduated from Texas State in photography. Was her strong suit, and she knew she didn't want to teach school. And then the youngest is John, who is with the Attorney General. And that I had the 4 children. I did lose the one child. I had gone back to the university to get certification in art education, and I was actually teaching. My first art room was the Buda bus barn, and that was during the integration. So after my first teaching job at the Buda school, because it was integrated, I went to Kyle, because that was the junior high. I was in the boiler room there. My next advancement was to the home ec building there, that's still there at Kyle. And then I got to design the new art room by Pfluger when we moved out to the Hayes Junior High, it was called. I thought I'd made the social register when I got on the shower list, because there was always a bridal shower for everybody in Buda. So I didn't make the list for a while. I actually made friends when my kids started to school. And so they would have a shower for whoever was getting married, boy or girl for the girlfriend or whoever it was. And they would have it in their own little houses. So the social life was giving showers. Later on, we would play bridge, and our kids would play together. When I first came to Buda, it was like 250. It suddenly was, 450, 500. You'd have to search the records. But I didn't think that the big development was until the 80s. Main Street was mostly filling station, 2 filling stations, grocery stores. The barber buildings were all boarded up, disbanded. Carl Shelf came to town, started fixing up the old 1898 store. There was a washateria there in one side of it. I think that Carl Shelf had a lot to do with the revitalization of Buda. Mostly it was the post office, grocery store, and filling